All right, welcome everybody to another edition of Millennials Are Killing Capitalism Live. Today, I am extremely honored to be joined by H.L.T. Quan. H.L.T. Quan is a political theorist and an award-winning filmmaker. Currently, she is an associate professor of justice and social inquiry in the School of Social Transformation at Arizona State University. She is also an affiliate faculty member in African American Studies, Asian Pacific American Studies, Women's and Gender Studies, and the Sidney Poitier New American Film School at ASU. You can read a full uh, bio in the show description below. Just say a couple other things. Quan is also the author of Growth Against Democracy, the author of the new book behind me that you see. Um, right here. So Become Ungovernable, an abolitionist feminist ethic for democratic living, which is out on the Black Critique series at Pluto Press, which folks who have been following the show for a while will know we've done a number of conversations on books in that series. And the book that we'll be talking about today, Quan is the editor of Cedric J. Robinson on Racial Capitalism, Black Internationalism, and Cultures of Resistance. And so obviously, well, not obviously. For people who don't know, I went to the Archives Unbound conference about, I guess, close to 4 weeks ago now, three weeks plus ago now. I met H.L.T. Quan at this conference. And so I'm really excited that she agreed to do this conversation today and talk about this collection, which is really an amazing collection of Cedric Robinson's work. So H.L.T. Quan, welcome to Millennials Are Killing Capitalism.
Good morning. Thank you for having me on this podcast, and I'm delighted to talk about this collection. It was a lot of work, but we can talk about that in a minute. But I just want to say I really appreciate Millennials Are Killing Capitalism. I think it's really important that we have genuine alternative media. As a media maker, I applaud your labor. I am grateful for your labor. Thank you.
Well, thank you. And I'm grateful for yours as well. And it was such a great thing about that conference to be around so many people who are engaged scholars who, operate in radical traditions, but also so many people who also kind of cross that divide or whatever we might say, right, between scholarly work and also media and cultural production. So yeah, it's wonderful. And then that's a legacy of Cedric and Elizabeth Robinson as well.
Absolutely. I totally, completely agree. And as you remember at the conference, I keep impressing on the fact that it was Elizabeth Robinson who taught several generations of media scholars and activists like myself to not only critique media, but also do media. And I should also say that Cedric Robinson not only wrote about the media, but also himself as a media producer. And so in that way, he very much was active in the media community, for sure.
Yeah, I appreciate that, especially because I think it's an aspect of their legacy that is not talked about or studied or, thought with enough. We
Indeed.
tend to kind of look at what's written on the page now, right? And not all of the media work that they did too
And
as a
that's
companion. Yeah, go
I'm
ahead.
sorry. And that's a missed opportunity, in my opinion, because I think, speaking of millennials, but millennials and Gen Z are in many ways so much more visually and media literate than their older compatriots. And so what that means is that it's important as we make our way through Cedric Robinson's body of work, and especially also Elizabeth's contribution to his work, but her own work as a media producer. I think we will learn that their work as a collective body of work, and I think it allows us to move away from this sort of notion that scholarship is produced in isolation as an individual, as somehow separate from the community of which we are part. And that's one of the things I want to really emphasize in Robinson's body of work. I think that we're so used to think of individuals, but Robinson's critique of leadership, so you find it in terms of order and elsewhere, is also his adherence to and insistence on seeing ourselves as connected to the larger body of humanity, of community, of the world. And that, I think, is something that it's counterintuitive, right? As a scholar, in particularly grounded in Western tradition, we don't think that, and certainly capitalist culture and production emphasize the individual not only because it may be more productively efficient, it is also easier to contain. That is to say, it's much easier to contain individual than it is to contain masses of people. Does that make sense?
It makes total sense. And as you're talking about it, I'm also thinking about, one of the things that, um, I've done study groups with Robinson's work before with folks, Black
Brilliant.
Marxism and others, and some of the interviews too, including, I think the last interview with Cedric and Elizabeth together, I think in Futures of Black Radicalism. Um, but one of the things that comes up among some people when you study things like Black Marxism is that it's really challenging text at times, right?
Mm.
And I think, you know, we have to pair that also with all of the work. I think that's true. I think it's rewarding when you engage with that challenge and you can actually get through to the insights that a text like that offers. But I also think that we also have to pair that with the fact that Cedric and Elizabeth were doing, news reports and weekly media and all kinds of things to try to make concepts and knowledge of what was going on in the world accessible to everyday people, and so there were multiple levels, right, of his engagement and his
Oh,
practice, so
absolutely.
yeah.
Absolutely. I think that the idea that scholarship is only be part of the privilege of the few, sort of the Straussian approach to, how we can read great text that is only a special, exceptional few, is fundamentally anti-democratic and elitist, and it's counter to Robinson's approach to scholarship. And then when I say Robinson's, I meant both of them. And as you said, the thing is, and I've done both radio. I've done radio since the late 80s. And then, of course, I was also a member of the World News Review. And then I have been working on documentary since the late 90s. One of the things is that when you do weekly shows and you have to be attuned to what's going on in the world, especially if you don't recycle and essentially just read the script that the White House or whatever state media provide you, then you really have to be on your feet. You really have to assess multiple sources, and that is a form of scholarship that most of the people in the world actually directly benefit from and learn from. Remember that, and this is something that I learned from doing some work for MARC, which is the organization that Elizabeth Robinson was involved with for many years. She was at one point vice president of MARC. MARC is the translation, French acronym for the World Association of Community Radio Broadcaster, before the era of podcasts, right? And, we up until very recently, the most of the people in the world still rely on the radio, right? Especially community radio for their main source of news and cultural entertainment and consumption. And what that means is that those of us who traffic in those spaces, we have to navigate different sources, different things, and do the work, as you suggest, of translation. Because it's not enough to write in really technical, inaccessible work. Although I'm not saying that scholarship should be like eating, I don't know, popcorn. And it's okay to struggle with a text. I mean, I think
Agreed.
struggle is an important thing. and we learn things. So it isn't about accessible or comfortable, easy, accessible as in comfortable or easy, but accessible as a way in which they have meaningful resonance in our lives. Does that make sense?
It absolutely does. Yeah, no, I appreciate that. And I agree totally. I mean, I think every time that we've had those discussions, whether it's reading Robinson or reading Sylvia Winter or Moten and Harney or other folks, there will always be points in the reading groups where people do get frustrated because they're struggling to access some of the things that are being, talked about. But through that, it's one of the reasons why I value collective study so much, right? Is that you can
Mm,
have other people, a lot of people, and then through everybody with different levels of knowledge or also experience with some of those ideas, those terms, the histories behind them. Um, that there is a process where we come to ideas that actually are fairly complicated but fairly important,
mhm.
and so I don't, yeah, I think that there's something to be said about sometimes complicated ideas, you know there you have to do work to be able to really get to those, and so I appreciate that as well. Um so I want to just pivot to the book itself.
Okay.
So you edited this collection. I'm sure that Elizabeth Robinson was involved in that. It sounds like Cedric was also involved in it
Oh,
at
yes.
some point. Yeah.
Oh, oh, yeah.
Um, and so could you talk a little bit about how it was put together and kind of some of the choices about what to include and kind of how to organize it?
Absolutely.
There's some themes, and I'm curious about the process around that.
Absolutely. So, and let me just add one more thing about what we were talking about, and we can easily transition into the book, and that is to say that I have to point out that we never complain. Well, maybe some of us do, how difficult Foucault is, or reading Foucault or Haraway or Marx. Now, it's true that that's Capital does not circulate as well as, say, the Red Book or Wretches of the Earth, that is Fanon and Mao in reverse order there. But on the other hand, they all have their important place. There are times where we need to sit with a text, and I think that I think people tend to dismiss. And I'm saying this as a political theorist. I think sometimes people provide certain kind of allowance. It's kind of like, oh well, since we're reading certain philosophy that we are familiar with, namely Western tradition, we allow for a certain level of difficulties. And yet here we are encountering a work, and for many of mainstream scholars, encountering a work that is completely, in terms of the historiography, precisely because it's been largely ignored and silent, that is new to them. They don't even have the terms of engagement with some of this work, and they complain that it's hard. I'm like, well, yeah, sure. It's like learning a new language. It's hard for us when we had to read Aristotle and Plato, right? So that's all I'm going to say on that. In terms of the book, so as you know, the context of this book is not straightforward at all. And I've shared some of it in the introduction and the preface with Elizabeth. Now, it has several beginnings, and elsewhere I've said that. The book, the beginning of a conversation on the collection of Cedric's writing that is not from book format emerged actually in the mid 1990s, in even yeah. So actually almost 30 years ago, maybe even 30 years ago, if my memory serves. And it began with the late Kofi Bueno Hajar. And if you're not familiar with Hajar, he's the author of Dictionary of Third World Terms and many other books. He was very prolific. He was also the speechwriter of Kwame Nkrumah, who was the first president of independent Ghana. Kofi was on his way to be the visiting professor in the Department of Black Study, and at the time, Cedric Robinson was the chair. And this was part of the larger attempt that some of us were trying to develop a doctoral program in Black Study. And at the time, if we have got approval, if we had succeeded in doing so, we would have been one of maybe the second or third at the latest on the outside PhD program in Black Study in the country. At any rate, Kofi, on his way to UCSB, UC Santa Barbara, had actually a stroke. And obviously could not teach. Now, under normal circumstances, that would mean, especially within a capitalist labor market, he's discarded, he's not needed, he's not necessary, and so on and so forth. Well, that's not how we as a community responded to this crisis. Robinson, particularly as chair of the Department of Black Study, he recruited a group of us to actually collectively took over the teaching burden for Kofi so that he could continue to receive insurance and medical insurance, especially, not that he was paid that much. But anyway, with that, he was able to recuperate from the stroke. So I ended up, for instance, teaching, help teach African politics. I think it was in 1991, as a matter of fact. so he's the earlier. So by the time Kofi recovered, part of and during that time, he get to know Robinson's work in a way that he didn't know before as well. He knew Robinson's work before because, of course, he's very familiar with trans African scholarship, right? And so he enlisted me, because by this time I have worked with him in different capacity, to help him put together, well, actually Robinson recommended that, with him to put together a collection of hard to find writing. This is before the era of PDFs. This is before World Wide Web, because he felt that Robinson's writing beyond, at that time, only his two books, right? The Terms of Order and Black Marxism, both of which, by the way, were out of print. He felt that Robinson need to be read and more broadly, his writing broadly distributed. So that's the one beginning, right? We talked about that, and Africa Press was going to, Kasahoon was so gracious, was saying, okay, if you all do it, we'll do it. And he actually may have even paid Kofi a commission to do so. I was a pro bono volunteer. Anyway, then nearly 20 years later, after we completed Mountains That Take Wing, that's the film on Angela Davis and Yuri Kochiyama, and my first monograph, Growth Against Democracy, Savage Developmentalism in a Modern World. After I finished with those, Elizabeth, Cedric, and I thought it was time to revisit the project. So that's the long explanation for the opening. Once we revisited, we look at Kofi's initial outline for the book, and it was actually much smaller, mostly focused on the critique of bourgeoisie historiography, a couple pieces on Pan-Africanism and Black internationalism. And of course, over the course of 20 years, Robinson have had a lot more work. He began to really shift a lot more focus on politics of representation and cultural work. So Cedric and I talk a lot about what needed to be in the collection that would capture not just what Kofi had encountered, but more. So then we did that, and life happens, different things happen, my health, different situation. So it took us a minute to get it done. My only regret is that it came out after he had passed away, because we actually started before his illness took a serious turn. So we even talked about the title. He obviously left some of the final decision up to me. I brought to him, and again, even back then, we didn't have, his work wasn't as accessible as it is now. So there were things that were out of print, so we had to track it down. And building from just his CV, which were never up to date because he wasn't that kind of scholar, to just see all the kind of things that he had written, because some of them he had forgotten that he has written. Also looking at his computer to look at things that he hadn't published. Elizabeth was really helpful in that area. And I have to say, Elizabeth was really helpful in sharing some of the insight in terms of, where to look, right? And what after Cedric passed away, I'm obviously just Elizabeth and I finalizing the collection. We initially imagined the I had to. It was painful. We had a much bigger collection, and we had to cut some out. And so at the end, it was a decision to make sure that it was representative, not of what people were interested in per se, because at the time, most people were still very much mostly interested in various iteration of Black Marxism. Very few people were actually talking about forgery. And then, of course, the Terms of Order. This was before the reprint of the Terms of Order came out. And of course, the other book, the two little book that people actually haven't really taken up, and that is the Anthropology of Marxism and Black Movements in America, which we can talk about the order of things in a minute. But so we want to make sure that it's representative. We want to make sure that it actually help map out his oeuvre, right? So that includes his media work. He spent many years with media criticism and cultural studies and media studies, politics of media. One of the first class I ever TA was TAing for him in the political science course on politics, media, and politics. So so we hope we succeeded. We had to cut out, as I said, because that's the politics of publication. David Sherman was so patient, so kind. And I know it broke his heart that we couldn't do more. I think one of it was, but we had a lot in. I mean, I think about what didn't get included, but I also think about what did get included, and it's massive. So,
Absolutely. I mean, and I have spent the last couple of weeks, it was actually the first time that I systemically read it from end to end, because I have read pieces out of this collection for several years. Kind of people will reference something and I'll go look it up and read it. And but it was really a great process to go through and read the whole book cover to cover. And yeah, I know we want to touch on some of the themes. There's something that you said there that is one of the themes that I wanted to touch on anyway, and so I think it's logical enough to continue there, which is you talked about how he shifted an interests to politics of representation and media work, and obviously forgeries of memory and meaning. He really takes up this project of racial regimes, and you see that work reflected in this collection as well. I think this is a really important area of his work. I think in some ways, we do talk a lot, or we hear the term racial capitalism has certainly spread its wings, right? And it is
right.
certainly included in a lot of people's work. Some people do very good work, I think, around this term, and some people, it seems like it's something that they use, right? They just sort of drop it in their work.
Mhm.
And I think that that we could say different things about that, but the work around racial regimes, I think, is something that is less. There's less work studying this, thinking with Cedric on this concept, and I think for me in left media, it's really an important concept because it's something that we're constantly kind of battling against, right? Is the way that media is complicit in crafting these racial regimes which seek to calibrate and recalibrate different in and out groups. I'm thinking right now, of course, there's this overwhelming right now bipartisan support for anti-asylum, anti-migrant, anti-refugee policies that we're seeing reflected through both of the duopoly political parties that we have in this country. But unfortunately, polls and things like this show how much purchase these policies have among the masses in the United States as well at this point. And, I think this is a product of these racial regimes. In the book, there's examples. He looks at the work of obviously D.W. Griffith and The Birth of a Nation, and Oscar Michaud's work kind of challenging these representations. He talks about, there's a piece on the mulatto on film. There's a
Mhm.
great piece on blaxploitation and the misrepresentation of liberation, which really proposes that Pam Grier and others were an intentional distortion, not Pam Grier the person, but the roles that she was given to play, an intentional distortion of Angela Davis, and her politics and the politics of liberation in that era. Um, so I just think, I'm interested in his work here because I think, he really shows how those in power, how capital uses its control over the cultural sphere, through mainstream media, through the news, to constantly put these different racial regimes in the service of capital's needs. And so, what are some of the key insights that you take from this work?
Well, I think as you noted, and it's a very keen observation, that it's important to understand how capacious racial regime as a concept that Robinson uses, and um, how useful, how instructive it is for us in these times. In these times where society is a spectacle, to borrow de Borges's term, but it's more than a spectacle. The spectacle is not is much more than hyperreality that we have to contend with, but it has a materiality, it has consciousness, it has praxis. So in many ways, the section, and you notice the section on representation is one of the larger section of the book. Partly, and I want to emphasize that both Cedric and Elizabeth, when we revisited the collection, the sort of the our options for this collection, it wasn't so much that Cedric told me which pieces should go into the collection, but it was that it was important for Cedric and Elizabeth to make sure that more than 40 years of his work, 4 decades, as long as he spent, in some way even longer than he spent on the development of capitalism, right? The critique of capitalism, the critique of dominant orthodox Marxism. The work that he has done both as a scholar, as a teacher, because he also taught media and politics, he taught Black cinema, and I also was a reader, and we were his assistant when he was teaching Black cinema for the first time, and also as a media activist, a media producer. So for me, racial regime at least Robinson argued, for those of you who are not familiar, racial regime is in many ways, if you think of, and he's a political theorist, and we can never forget that, right? Robinson was a really good political theorist, despite the fact that political science rarely ever claim him. That means that when we think of regime, we think of governing structure, right? It's a way in which we govern people. And in the case of racial regime, it's a way we govern people's consciousness. And consciousness, I know one of the things you want to talk about in terms of Robinson's work, consciousness is very important, along with history, right? And the way in which we reform our memory, that's history, and the way in which we learn to imagine different things, including freeing ourselves, has to do with our consciousness. And racial regime is an instrument of governing. It is how we govern people into racialism. It is how we govern people to continue to rely on these tropes that may seem dated, but nevertheless has utility in governing, right? And so one of the things that's really important to understand his argument about racial regime is that these regimes are actually very unstable. They're unstable because they are fiction. They're unstable because they're not real. They're part of the hyper real. right? They're part of the spectacle. And so we have to come back again and again to reform them, to fix them so that they would have better utility. But we should always ask, why were they so unstable in the first place? And that's really an important question to ask. They're unstable in part because we know, and Robinson put a lot of stock in our own consciousness, the people's consciousness, that in our real life, from what we do, that in our labor, from how we live, as in our relationship, in our community, we know that the thing we are being taught about race is not real. It's a fiction. And so we move against it, we change it. And then that means that authority have to reform the instrument of governing us, right? So that's why it's unstable. So if one trope, that is, let's use the classic trope of the lazy slave. Well, the evidence of their industry, the evidence of their contributions, the evidence of their ingenuity counter that. Well, then we have to come up with another fiction. So the black criminal, and so on and so forth. You see what I mean? But again and again, the reality, the materiality of life and our consciousness rub against these racial regimes. And so I think Robinson was a very optimistic dude. You know, he was very optimistic. He had faith in the people. He had faith that people in struggle build lasting relationship, build lasting community, build community that constantly escaped the imagination, the limited imagination of the governing class. Does that make sense? I don't know if I answered your question. Did I answer your question?
You what you said is brilliant, whether you answered my question or not. I don't really whether you answered my question is
okay.
No. I think you did. I mean, I think, let's see, was there any part of it that you didn't answer?
Well, I just want to say that, so a lot of the work we intentionally published, a lot of the material before the release of Forgery and Meaning, both Elizabeth and I wanted to showcase that Cedric's work on, and for the lack of a better term, critical representation studies, went beyond filmic representation, because, and this goes back to one of your concern too, is that it's important to understand that culture matter, and cultural work especially matter. It's matter not only because it's worthy of our intellectual attention, but more importantly, it's important to us because that's how we will feed ourselves. Because we're never gonna outgun and outmoney the ruling class, the capitalist ruling class. But in our daily lives, in our practice, in our cultural work, we might have a possibility. And so what that means is that Robinson, toward the end of it, he began to transition. One of the piece was on fiction, all right? Another piece, he was beginning to actually looking at cartoons, political cartoons. So he after the publication of Forgery, he began to move into cartoons as well. So we had conversations about that as well. So I want to make sure we both publish stuff that came before, Forgery, but also the kind of direction that he went in other beyond filmic representation. But absolutely, I think you mentioned the piece on blaxploitation. You're absolutely right about that. He insisted that in his public presentation, in his classes, in both the Black Cinema class and the Media and Politics class, as well as in publication, which came together in the piece. And blaxploitation, again, this goes back to how unstable the racial regimes are. They keep having to reform themselves. So by the late 90s, where we experienced the so-called golden age of Black independent filmmaking, what we were also being treated to is essentially a new iteration of blaxploitation with the sort of the boy in the hood filmic genre. Does that make sense?
It makes total sense. And that essay is incredible. I mean, I encourage anybody to read that essay. I mean, I've always you know, I'm somebody who on some level appreciates some of the film from Black exploitation and has always been interested in it. And similarly, as you talk about those 90s films, I grew up watching those films.
Hmm.
Um, but I think his insights into particularly what was being attacked and foreclosed in those films, what was being governed, right, to talk about
Right.
the racial regimes, um, it's so clear because yeah, I mean, there are very few um, black exploitation films that really have any kind of revolutionary character to them, and yet what they're representing is basically a demonization of revolutionaries, right? It is a way uh of subtly taking the imagery and the iconography, and taking away the radical politics,
That's right.
removing,
Defangling.
that. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah,
So
absolutely.
it was a great essay. Yeah. Well, we're talking about culture. Let's talk about the first attack. The
Okay.
first attack is the attack on culture. Um, there's this theme that kind of runs through Robinson's work, and you see it through this book at different elements. Um, in that piece, which is a piece that he this is a speech, right? Isn't this right? This
Hmm.
is a
Yeah.
speech that he gives at SUNY Binghamton
Yep.
during that period, which we've talked about with Josh Myers before, where um, he brings Walter Rodney at one point, brings
Hmm.
CLR James, he brings Amiri Baraka, and you kind of note all of that
Hmm.
in the introduction. Um, and he gives this great lecture on the first attack is the attack on culture. And he talks about Marx and the Jewish question. Um, and, this goes back, like, when you read his piece later on about Malcolm X too, and Malcolm X comes up in this piece as well. Um, this idea of the need to reverse the symbols, right? To
Hmm.
reverse, quotes from the Malcolm X pieces. He said he could turn their hatred of him and the institutions by which they shamed him into fear of him.
Hmm.
Another quote is the nation, meaning the Nation of Islam in this case, restored to him family, literally and spiritually, with the same resoluteness which the devils had used to snatch it from him, end quote. And then I'm going to move to Cabral real quick. Robinson writes of Cabral. Cabral would combine the development of revolutionary strategy and theory in his thought on the
Hmm.
peasantry, on the cultures of resistance, again, a theme of the book, and on
Hmm.
the national liberation movement, end quote. And so, yeah, where do we go from here?
Okay.
I think yeah, go ahead. You just go.
Well, a few years ago, Tiffany Willoughby Harrod, associate professor at UC Irvine, and I collaborated on putting together a special collection of essay by Cedric Robin. Not sorry, a special issue, a journal issue on African identities on Cedric's work. And while there were a couple of scholars who wrote on extending Robinson's Black Marxism, that work we also extend other work, and I wrote a piece on the Robinsonian method, and he teased me afterward because like he's like, what's the Robinsonian method? And one other thing I point out in that piece is that it's important to understand how pivotal, how important people like Cabral is to Robinson's intellectual oeuvre. And that has to do with the importance of culture. Cabral's absolute emphasis on culture. And I repeat this everywhere I talk, when I talk about Cabral, you should know that I wanted to write my doctoral dissertation on Cabral. So I've spent some years reading. And Robinson, one of the few time in his life, maybe where he was really practical in that way, he's like, no, I don't think you're going to be able to get a job. so I said, okay, well, I'll do theory, but I also do comparative politics, and I so we went on different direction. But so Cabral's was very important to Robinson in terms of his theory of change, his theory of revolutionary change, especially. And Cabral was really famous in some way in one of his essay or speech called "Return to the Source," and he talks about how one might be dominated materially and even politically, but it is really, really difficult to dominate a people culturally. And so therein lies the seeds of liberation. So we need to return to the source. Just as Robinson would later say that, I think in the first essay of this collection, right, which is The Native Theory of History, where he said African people as producers of material and cultural wealth, as producers of ideologies and epistemologies, as producers of history, must be accounted for. So that the first part responds to the silences, right, and the marginalization in history, but that this can be done authentically in our own term. And that is where, basically Robinson is in many ways echoing Cabral in the need to emphasize the importance of the people, the importance of the culture in fashioning our tools against oppression and domination. It isn't that he had an answer, right? Neither Cabral, Cabral had more answer, he claimed, but Robinson, I don't think, claimed he had the answer. What he claimed is that there are ways to go about doing things that may lead us to answer, if not answer, at least to the right questions to ask. Does that make sense? So to think about this, the first attack is an attack on culture, is in many ways where Robinson not only signaled the importance of culture, and see, this piece is one of the early. This is 1975, so well before Terms of Order, well before Black Marxism, the making of the Black radical tradition. And so I think it is really insightful in understanding Robinson's theoretical commitment, investment in delineating people's organizations and structures, and beginning his attack or the demystification of leadership. But it is also where he articulates, where he said, the centrality of the collective. So we were talking about the importance of communities and people earlier. So ideas, structures, the organizations of a movement come from the collective. They do not come out of the individual. So again and again, he insists, and later on in A Native Theory of History, he would cite the first attack as the attack of the culture, the same phrase. But also, he pointed out that the leaders, even the scholars, are impacted by the subject of our inquiry, by the movement that we think we are leading. Yeah, we are impacted by their consciousness, by their doing things. It isn't coming. So in his piece on Malcolm, it's really, really clear that Malcolm is learning as much from the people as Malcolm needed the people, right? For Malcolm Little needed the people to turn him into Malcolm X. Without the people, he would remain Malcolm Little.
Sorry, I'm muted. I just want to share this one passage that I highlighted. I'm just going to read it for folks. With the emergence, we're talking about America in general, of Malcolm X, with all the machinations which might have distorted that event in terms of electronic media, printed media, the significance of Malcolm X in the minds of non-Blacks in general, with all those machinations which might have distorted that phenomenon, the appearance of Malcolm X should have told you that there was a movement, not that there would be, not that something was about to happen, but that it was already happening. And if we move back to the short section that I read from Reich earlier, we should also know something else about the same event. Malcolm X would not produce any element in the ideology which was not already present in the Black movement.
That's right.
It was not important that he say something new. It was not important that he articulate novel insights. It was important that he reflect the historical experiences, the understanding, the comprehensions of the masses of Black people in this country and in the Caribbean. That is what he said. He didn't say anything new. He did not say anything new. It was the organized presentation which was new. So there we have, I hope, an example, a concrete example of this premise that the ideas, the structures, the organizations of a movement, a social movement, comes from the collective. It does not come from the individual. That sensitivity, a consciousness of that, it seems to me, is an important beginning. That the first attack is an attack on culture. Thank you. So that's the end of that
Yes.
piece. But I just wanted to share that because I think it elucidates what you were just
I think
talking about.
it captures really well, and I really appreciate you sharing that whole passage. And that's why I'm saying sometimes the text matter. We do need to go read it, right? So again and again we see this reiterated in Robinson's work, right? So in Black Marxism, he writes about C.R.R. James' work and W.E.B. Du Bois and Richard Wright, and we're being reminded that they are, as he said, not the they're not the architect of the thing. They're not the inventor of the thing. They're just part of it, right? So it's important to understand that it is all, and in Black Movements, which was published, in many ways, he actually finished, and I said this in the foreword of the Anthropology of Marxism. He actually had finished the first draft, or actually it's more than the first draft because we were able to read it. He had already completed Anthropology of Marxism before he turned his attention to Black movements in America. So in Anthropology of Marxism, he critiqued this sort of canonization of Marxism as the singular source of socialism. And so he pointed to the people's movement, the poverty movement in Europe. And in Black movement in America, he critiqued sort of the Black bourgeoisie, the sort of mainstream civil rights movement in some way, as somehow the source, the authority of some of the most radical Black sources of Black transformation. Instead, he pointed to communities of slaves and religious community and so on and so forth, right? So as the Black feminists later would both before and after have pointed out, I think Alice Walker is most famously pointed out that when we look to the Black church tradition, we look to the ministers, but we forgot the congregation, and the congregation are mostly made up of women. And so in that way, parallel to that is Robinson's attempt again and again to point us to the communities of resistance and not just the individual leaders.
Yeah, appreciate that. So let's see where to go. Let's talk about bourgeois historiography, because this is, as you said, is a similar, it's one of the central themes again within the book. It's something that you talked about in your one of your contributions to a panel at the conference. And it was really a particular area for Robinson that he wanted to debunk and demystify. And it also reminds me a little bit because, as you say, Robinson, he is critical of a lot of different. He's critical of European radicalism. He's critical of, many things. And Ruth Wilson Gilmore, when we interviewed her, one of the things she said is that Cedric Robinson demanded a lot of himself. He demanded a lot of his friends and his students and his enemies as well. And I'm sure, as someone who was close to him for as long as you were, you have experience with this side of Cedric too. And so I'm curious if you could offer some reflections on that, on his high expectations and demands for scholarship and for thinking, and also for revolutionary theory too.
Sure. And that was very sneaky. I just want to say, as a way to ask me to talk about bourgeois historiography or Robinson's critique of bourgeois historiography, because obviously that's one of the point. in which I find both interesting and problematic in terms of how people are reacting to it, not so much Robinson's work. So let me, by way of answering, first I will answer it as from the perspective of his student, as a student, because as you know, I took classes with him. Well, my first encounter with Cedric, of course, is actually not in a classroom, but at a political meeting in which we met underground. And he and another faculty were the only two faculty that were invited, because we did not, unlike today, we don't actually broadcast. I mean, it was by invitation only, I'm afraid. So we invited them because they have been political on campus. And so that was my first meeting. And after that, no one, after what he said to us, after what transpired at that meeting, no one wanted to go see him, to lobby him, because, he was one of the people that helped overthrow a regime at UCSB. And so naturally he would be our ally, but yet no one wanted to go see him because because I was only a first year student, I didn't know any better. So I volunteered because I actually quite liked him. I thought he was, he called us to task. And so that is the demand, right? The expectations that we have to and need to do better. Okay. So I I didn't know any better, which is sometimes how we ended up doing better. It's not because not because we know, but because we don't know any better. So I went to see him, which meant that I read Black Marxism when I was my first year as a student, a college student. That summer, I would end up taking the seminar, which I guess not so much Black Marxism, but just Marxism. It was a seminar on Marxism. So of course we read Black Marxism, but we also read other things. And so for Robinson, because there has been so much, the how should you say, the edifice has been so elaborated and so invested upon, that for us to even get to a kernel of something relevant, we have to do better. We have to be rigorous. So I will return to the very first essay that we chose collectively as I think Cedric and Elizabeth kind of gave me the freedom. They always do, both as student and friend, and in this case, editor, to do whatever they thought I wanted to do. And I really wanted Native Theory of History to be the first essay. So it's out of order, right? But still, because it was published, I think, in 1989. I find that essay particularly instructive for scholars and students and activists, not just because, activists are scholars too. And so both as a conceptual frame and as a methodological approach. So it was important that we signal very early on Robinson's pedagogy and methodology. And it began by saying the construction of radical social theory requires coming to terms with the fundamental nature of historical movement, the characters of social organization and structure and their historical thrust, and the formulations of social consciousness. Put differently, change, adaptation, and thought are the boundary which mark such social theories. You have it. You have all of the element, right, for a native theory of history or radical theories or counter discursive theorization. Both, actually, not or, and. So radical theory and counter discursive theorization. So we begin with historical movement, social organizations and structures, consciousness, but also the importance of temporality or the historical thrust, right? That's all the thing we need to do. It's important to understand that abstraction is very violent, right? Historically, people and community, whole swath of the world have been literally abstracted into nothingness, erased, silenced from the pages of history, from history. Precisely because it is so, Robinson insists that theorists pay attention to the selection, the integration, the interpretation of events. It is not enough to bring somebody in. But why are we bringing them in? Who are they? What are they? What are they as people, not as individuals? What are they as people? How have they lived? How have they seen themselves? How have they changed their life and in the process changed our lives? Relationships, right? So he, in that very brief thing that I just read to you, he showed us the terms of his approach and his theoretical construction. It is very transparent of him. That's his pedagogy, to be transparent, to show you so that you can do it for yourself, right? So it is scholar objectify, right? The consciousness of the subject of our inquiry, as scholars do, but rarely reflexive of our own complexity, complicity, and investment in that very inquiry. This is what George Lipset called the possessive investments in whatever, whiteness, racial regime, whatever, okay? And to counter that, Robinson insists that we acquire consciousness that our subjects possess and clearly recognize our positionality in relation to those consciousness. That's what feminists call feminist reflexivity. I don't know what Robinson called it, but what he called it is this is how we do theory. This is the only way radical theory can divest itself from its complicity. You saw his critique in this piece of Black scholasticism, right? And students of radical traditions, students of liberation movement should read this carefully. As he pointed out, Black scholasticism does not challenge theft, but attempt to deflect it, right? So that's theft of consciousness, theft of labor, life, and material well-being. So how do we not do that? How do we move out of that? Because all that does is it corrects the facility of dominant, facticity, he said, of dominant scholarship. So it reforms normal science. It doesn't subvert it. It doesn't overthrow it. So critique is important. That's the first stage. But beyond that, we have to do reconstruction and maybe overthrowing. But you can overthrow, but where do we go from there? A lot of the young activist scholars today talk about a feminist abolitionism. And that feminist abolitionism doesn't just correct or reform the correctional, quote unquote, because it's correcting itself already, the correctional institution, right? But we need to subvert it. We need to overthrow it. We need to transform it by focusing on, as Ruthie is so good at pointing out, the things that we are already doing that undermines it, that shakes it to its very foundation. That's what Robinson is demand of us. So yes, he was very hard on his student and his friends and his enemy, but you know what? We are better for it. So here's the thing. I want to be very clear that there has been a lot of hype on Robinson's work, not in a good way. It's not unlike the exaggeration of the communist threats in the dominantly authoritarian regime, like Brazil, 1964, or United States in the 1950s, or the queer threat in Russia in the early 21st century. This is a strategic response by the governing people, wherever by the authority, meant to silence and contain, right? It isn't, as I said at the conference, yes, we need to critique Black bourgeoisie historiography because it's inadequate. He has shown that at its very best, it merely reflects, it doesn't subvert, right? But the issue here is about the democratization of liberation, of history of liberations. If we don't identify a source as a singular source for all of our salvation, then we are freed up to look in a lot of different places. And that means we might encounter a lot of different tools that are useful to us, particularly for how we can live and how we can liberate ourselves. I think that's a good thing. Right? I think that's a good thing. So deconstruction is, yes, very necessary. But without reconstruction, without overthrowing the terms of dominant scholarship, it's inadequate, it's at best. And we're in serious trouble otherwise. And so I think that Marx, however helpful Marx was, right? Because Robinson wasn't antagonistic toward class analytic. I think people need to keep saying that to themselves and keep rereading Robinson. Robinson actually, so I don't take seriously the charge that Robinson is a Black nationalist any more than the charge that he was not performing class analytic. He has written extensively and more than ably to critique the Black bourgeoisie, both in real life and in representations, in the politics of representations. So the critique has been consistent, but so has his critique, as you point out, of Black national leaders. Now, Robinson's critique of capitalism is not a critique of national economies. This is where I think many people err. Capitalism is not a nation-state operation, right? His critique of capitalism is a critique of global capitalism. Capitalism as a global structure. I think he was, knowing their personal history and knowing where he has been, and also me personally have also been a visiting researcher at the Fernand Braudel Center. I know for a fact that he was sympathetic to war system theory, Wallerstein, right? But he recognized earlier than most of us the limitations of war system theory as one that was wedded to the architectonic structure of Marxist historiography. And so, true to his methods and his expectation of himself, he wanted to go back and look at the fundamental nature of historical movements, of people, of community, of context. And there, Marxist historians, Marxist analysts often leave a lot to be desired. That's why we have feminist Marxist theory. We have third world Marxist theory. I mean, when you read Fanon and you read Mao, what do you think those things were? Or Cabral? They were criticism of the limitation of not only Marx, but also of Lenin and those who came after.
I appreciate that a lot. And I think, if folks read, the last section of this book too, and you look at, for instance, the piece he writes about Cabral, it's quite clear that, and you saying that Cabral is the most important kind of revolutionary theorist for him. I think, you can see that in that piece, that there's a great, recognition of what Cabral does as a revolutionary theorist in terms of taking, Cabral, for folks who don't know, he learns Marxism in Lisbon.
Mm-hmm.
He learns the tools of it, but bringing back to Guinea-Bissau, there's not a working class. There's
Nope.
not, there's the kind of colonial bourgeoisie, the kind of the petty bourgeoisie, of folks that are kind of involved in colonial management, and then there's the peasantry, right?
Mm-hmm.
And again, it's something I'm looking forward to talking to more with some of the other folks too that were at the conference, because Robinson does a lot of work around peasants movements and thinking
Mm-hmm.
about the importance of the peasantry. And yeah, I mean, I read it as him looking at, I think you said it in one of the presentations, about a critique of orthodox Marxism,
Mm-hmm.
right? A critique of taking certain formulations of Marx as orthodoxies rather than as attempts to read, his own context, which Robinson again goes back through and talks about how there's some bourgeois historiography in the way that Marx develops historical materialism as well.
Mm-hmm.
And so, yeah, I think that I appreciate all of what you just said. And I think it's a really important thing to understand that Robinson was certainly not antagonistic to, oh, somebody said no sound. Does everybody hear okay? Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Okay. Okay. That he certainly was not antagonistic to revolutionary theory, but he was demanding of revolutionary theory. And that he would seek to critique it in areas that he thought that it didn't line up with history or with the specifics of people's struggles. And
Yeah.
so yeah, I appreciate that insight and that reflection. And I think regarding I mean, I'm with you, because I think the most interesting and relevant and important strains of Marxism for me, they come from the third world. They come
Yes.
from people, whether it's, Walter Rodney or Cabral or Samir Amin or, or Claudia Jones, right? Thinking about the third world within the first world, right? That, and these people were people who challenged the orthodoxies and the kind of Eurocentric version of what that might mean.
Yes.
So
And I think it's important to point out that Robinson was much more invested in socialism and socialist struggle than he was with Marxism or Marxist struggle. And I think that there is a fundamental difference between those two. And I think we need to understand that. Given his insistence that we look at people holistically, right? That is to say that we're not just political animals, but we're also cultural beings, we are socially reproductive being, and so on and so forth. That the political or even the material are only several dimensions of our lives, not our entire life. Given that is the case, Marxist theory is woefully inadequate. And again, as I said, that's why we have to have all these revisions. But the other thing I think is important to point out too is that so Robinson is invested in the socialist struggle and socialism. He had the much of his issues with Marxism, Orthodox Marxism, particularly, has to do with Marxist theory of change, the architectonic, linear, progressive development of history per European capitalist development, right? So it's also very so insofar as his theory of Robinson's theory of change demands that he look to the people, look to social movement. And this is why his work for a political theorist, for anybody really, is extraordinarily theoretical. We can't do it without that history. Right? As I tell my student all the time, theory rarely ever surprised me. People do. History does. And that's why we have to be rigorous. And so that there's the importance to look to cultural movement, look to social movement, look to social consciousness. The other thing that's also important to remember is that Robinson has always mistrust leaders, right? Because they're more easily corruptible, and they're insofar as their proximity to affluence allows them to be honor among thieves, or the honor positions, I presume honor positions of thieves, but not so much in relations to the larger collective, and that's why I really think that because he saw leaders, including Black national leaders, as at best mere catalysts of something larger. I think so just like the nation has to contend with the world in relation to capitalist development and everything else, so the individual have to contend with the people, the collective. And so his theory of change grounded in people's consciousness and action. So Pan-Africanism, yes. Black internationalism, yes. Not Black nationalism. I'll put my whatever reputation I have left out there and insist on that. Well, I don't think it's a terribly profound one, because I think if you read his work, it's very clear.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's clear too. I mean, I think it's clear in his critique of the Black bourgeoisie and the colonial bourgeoisie too within national movements, and also in that piece on Pan-Africanism, in which people should read, which he talks about different kinds of Pan-Africanism as well, and the kind of Pan-Africanism that he's interested in at that point is very much a kind of I would call it like a black transnationalism almost,
Oh yeah. Oh yes, transnational.
yeah.
I think that's right, because the nation state is merely, um, as Basil Davison, I think, call it, the black man's burden, and I think Robinson most largely subscribed to that idea. And that is not to say that he does not plays a very important position, privilege, the process of national liberation, but understood it for what it was, which is has its own limitation. Robinson has always insisted that we don't just, and he was very impatient when people read one piece of work and then think that they know all of a person's work, because I remember he pointed out to me, you know, if you read Foucault, he says, if you read Discipline and Punish, that's not the same Foucault as the Foucault that wrote The History of Sexuality. And that's right. Right. This is well before Foucault actually achieved the kind of dominance that we encounter now. Similarly, he was very impatient with, and I think we included the piece in the collection on Fanon, where people, instead of reading all of Fanon's work, particularly his work on African Revolution and The Wretched of the Earth, which is about African Revolution and Third World independence or Third World decolonization, people only focus on Black Skin, White Mass, which is the work of an earlier Fanon. And so I would say that, like Cabral, Third World revolutionary theorists and movements were very important in Robinson's work, and we try to feature that prominently in the collection.
Absolutely. And in that piece on Fanon, I know I got to let you go in a minute, but in that piece on Fanon, one of the things that I appreciated is that part of what was at stake for him was actually Edward Said. It was actually Palestine.
Yes.
Right. And so he was concerned that the distortion and the misrepresentation of Fanon was actually an attack on Palestine and on Palestinian liberation. And we've seen that since, in the last 9 months, we've seen, people who are scholars of Fanon also, try to leverage Fanon in some way against Palestinian liberation or something, and I think that's it's a legacy of something that he started to catch quite a long time ago.
I'm so glad. Thank you for bringing that up. I'm so glad that as we wrap up this conversation, we return to Palestine. It's important to understand that the formation of Third World News Review, which both Cedric and Elizabeth spent so much of their lives building and cohering and training a whole generation in many ways on policy analysis, not to mention media criticism, began as an impetus to respond to the complete silence on coverage in the Middle East, including the civil war in Lebanon, and then later would be the first Intifada. My introduction to Third World News Review, listening to it, has to do with also listening to Cedric and Elizabeth's deconstruction of U.S. foreign policy and Israeli policy on Palestine, and also again the Middle East. Of course, it was called Third World News Review. We cover essentially the global South and the U.S. and Europeans part, because I use this term third worldization to explain spaces, the third world spaces in the so-called metropole. And I think that Robinson again and again go back to Palestine, be it in his critique of the coverage on terrorism in the United States in the aftermath of September 11th, right? Or later in the piece where they talk about the occupation of Palestine more explicitly on Zionism and fascism. it is so important that, and in many ways, by bringing Palestine in, we can really see how capacious at one level third world consciousness is and radical Black internationalism can be. Right now, obviously, I not only the South Africans, as rightly so, say that if Palestine is not free, none of us are free, for historical reason, for mutual solidarity, for a history of mutual solidarity. But we too need to remind ourselves that, right? Because that's part of. So you were talking about the expectation and the demand. For us to commit ourselves to the kind of intellectual rigor and capaciousness of this type of work, we need to be able to see how intimately our life is connected to Palestine and how complicit we are in that genocide. Does that make sense? And it's of course one can say Robinson would have a lot to say if he were around in this moment about Palestine. Well, I want to say two things in response to that. He has said a lot about Palestine while he was here, and Elizabeth has continued to speak out and said a lot about Palestine, has said and continue to say a lot about Palestine. And there are a lot of Cedric Robinson and there are a lot of Elizabeth Robinson around that we can learn from. We have no more excuse. We have no more excuse to not talk about Palestine and to not talk about this genocide.
Amen to that. I'm going to let you go because that's a great place to leave it as it is. There was a question that I'm going to loop into a future conversation because I think I would love to have you back on when we can to discuss your new book, Become Ungovernable, which continues. You're certainly thinking with Robinson, elaborating obviously into your own work, but some of the themes we didn't cover a lot today were anti-democracy, fascism. You mentioned Zionism in relation to that in that piece as well. And the question that somebody asked was about Black anarchism and Cedric, which I think there's a whole topic that we can kind of weave into that discussion. And so I just want to acknowledge that question and save it. And but I do want to let you go because I did tell you an hour. And so anyways, I appreciate so much this conversation, HQ, if I can call you that.
Please do.
I look forward to continuing our conversation in hopefully the near future.
Me too. And thank you. And I would welcome a conversation on both Black anarchism and on Become Ungovernable. And again, I can't thank you enough, especially in this time of censorship and fascism and authoritarianism that we have. Millennials are killing capitalism.
Well, thank you so much. Thank you for your work. Thank you for this collection. Please, everybody, if you don't have a copy, go pick it up because there's so much amazing work in it that people need to read. So thank you. All right.